December 14th, 1944, Sergeant Frank Griffin stood in the turret of his M36 tank destroyer, watching the tree line 300 yards ahead. His crew had been in Belgium for exactly 6 days. In that time, they'd seen more German armor than in their previous 3 months combined. The intelligence report sat folded in Griffin's pocket. He'd read it twice already that morning. Testing by 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion confirms M36 90mm gun cannot penetrate Tiger II frontal armor at any range with available ammunition. Recommend extreme caution when engaging heavy German tanks. Griffin's gunner, Corporal James Novak, had read it too. So had the loader, Private Eddie Walsh, and the driver, Specialist Tom Henderson. They all knew what it meant. The weapon they'd been trained on, the gun they'd been told would finally give them parity with German heavy armor, was officially inadequate. The M36 Jackson was supposed to be America's answer to the Panther and Tiger 90mm main gun, the most powerful armament on any American armored vehicle in Europe. It had arrived just 2 months earlier, in October 1944, with promises that it could engage any German tank on equal terms. Now, 6 weeks later, official testing said otherwise. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem wasn't theoretical, it was mathematical, physical, undeniable. The Tiger II, which the Americans called the King Tiger, had frontal armor 7 inches thick, sloped at 40 degrees. The M36's standard M82 armor-piercing round could penetrate roughly 5 inches of armor at 1,000 yards. Against flat plate, it might punch through. Against the King Tiger's sloped glacis, the shell would ricochet every time. The Germans knew it. American tank destroyer crews knew it. And in mid-December 1944, German forces were massing for what would become the largest armored offensive on the Western Front since D-Day. Griffin had joined the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion in September, just as the M36 were being issued. Before that, he'd commanded an M10 Wolverine, armed with a 3-inch gun that struggled against even medium German tanks past 500 yards. The M36 was supposed to change everything. The 90mm M3 gun was adapted from an anti-aircraft weapon. It fired a 24-pound projectile at 2,800 feet per second. On paper, it matched the famous German 88mm gun used on the Tiger Y. The same calculations that made the 88 legendary should have made the 90mm equally feared. But the Germans had upgraded. The Tiger II mounted a longer, more powerful 88mm gun, the KWK-43. It could penetrate the M36's thin armor from 2,000 yards. The M36 couldn't reliably penetrate the Tiger II from any distance, not frontally. American tank destroyer doctrine had always emphasized mobility over armor. The idea was simple. Don't get hit. Use speed, use positioning, ambush the enemy, shoot first, displace before they can return fire. It worked against Panzerabwehr and Stugs. It even worked against Panthers if you caught them from the side. Against King Tigers, the doctrine fell apart. The King Tiger weighed 70 tons. It had armor that made it nearly impervious from the front. Its gun could kill anything the Americans fielded from distances where American guns couldn't even see the target clearly. And while it was slow, it didn't need to be fast. It just needed to point its frontal armor toward the threat and wait. Griffin's battalion had received its first M36s in late October. The vehicles came with technical manuals, gunnery tables, and optimistic briefings about how the 90mm would finally let American tank destroyers engage German heavy armor effectively. The crews trained for 2 weeks, familiarizing themselves with the new turret layout, the electric traverse system, the slightly different recoil characteristics of the bigger gun. Then they went to the front, and reality set in. On November 23rd, near Pfuffendorf, elements of the 702nd engaged a German defensive position that included 3 Tiger IIs. The German tanks were hull down, dug in, presenting only their thickest frontal armor. American tank destroyers opened fire from 1,500 yards. The 90mm shells hit. Sparks flew. The shells ricocheted into the sky. The Tigers returned fire. 2 M36s were destroyed. 1 M4 Sherman was knocked out. The Americans withdrew. After-action reports noted that the 90mm gun had achieved multiple hits on Tiger II frontal armor with no penetrations. Crews reported that the German tanks seemed confident, almost contemptuous, maintaining their positions and methodically engaging American vehicles without attempting to maneuver for better angles. The psychological impact was immediate. Tank destroyer crews had spent the previous year learning to respect German armor. The Panther was deadly. The Tiger. I was terrifying, but they were killable, especially if you got them from the side or caught them moving. The King Tiger seemed unkillable. More engagements followed. Near Gerionsweiler on November 28th, outside Aldenhoven on December 2nd. Each time, M36s hit King Tigers frontally. Each time, the shells bounced off. Each time, American vehicles burned. The formal testing came in early December. The 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion fired repeated shots at a captured King Tiger hull from various ranges, 1,000 yards, 500 yards. Even at point-blank range, the standard M82 armor-piercing round could not reliably penetrate the frontal glacis. The report was classified, but word spread through the tank destroyer battalions in days. The gun everyone had been counting on didn't work. Not against the heaviest German armor. Not when it mattered most. Griffin remembered the conversation in his crew's bivouac the night after they'd gotten word about the testing. Walsh, the loader, had asked the obvious question. "So, what are we supposed to do if we run into a King Tiger?" Henderson, the driver, had an answer. "Run." Novak, the gunner, was more analytical. "The report said frontal armor, right? What about the sides? What about the turret?" "Good luck getting a side shot," Henderson said. "Those things don't move fast, but their doctrine is to keep the front toward the enemy, and the turret face is nearly as thick as the hull." "Then we're fucked." Griffin had let them talk. They needed to process it, needed to work through the fear. But privately, he was doing his own calculations. The M36 carried 47 rounds of 90mm ammunition. 11 rounds were stored in the turret bustle. 36 were in the hull sponsons. Standard combat load was 40 rounds of M82 armor-piercing and 7 rounds of M71 high-explosive for soft targets. If the armor-piercing rounds wouldn't work against King Tigers, maybe there were alternatives. The technical manual mentioned 2 experimental rounds. The T-16 HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing, used a tungsten carbide core and could theoretically penetrate 8.7 inches of armor at 500 yards. The T-33, a heat-treated steel shot with improved ballistics, was supposed to perform better against sloped armor than the standard M82. Neither round was in general distribution. The HVOP rounds required tungsten, which was in short supply. The T-33 was still experimental. A few rounds had been issued to some units for field testing, but most tank destroyer battalions had never seen them. Griffin had put in a request through his company commander. Captain Morrison had filed the paperwork up the chain. Days passed. No response. Meanwhile, German activity increased along the front. Reconnaissance flights reported armor concentrations in the Ardennes forest. Prisoners mentioned training for offensive operations. Allied intelligence assessed the reports and concluded the Germans were conducting defensive preparations, possibly shifting units to counter expected Allied advances. The assessment was wrong. On the morning of December 16, 1944, German forces launched Operation Wacht am Rhein. Watch on the Rhine. 29 divisions, including 10 panzer divisions, attacked along an 80-mile front through the Ardennes. The offensive caught American forces completely by surprise. The 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion was positioned near St. Vith, a critical road junction in eastern Belgium. When the attack began, Griffin's company was 10 miles behind the front lines, supposedly in a rest area. Within hours, they were combat-loaded and moving toward the sound of guns. The weather was overcast, near freezing, with low clouds that grounded Allied air support. Perfect conditions for a German offensive. By evening of the first day, German spearheads had penetrated 15 miles in some sectors. American units were falling back, some in good order, others in confusion. Reports coming back from the forward areas mentioned heavy German armor, lots of Panthers, multiple Tigers, and King Tigers, definitely King Tigers. Griffin's platoon leader, Lieutenant Aaron Moss, briefed the crews at dusk. The situation is fluid. German armor is advancing on multiple axes towards St. Vith. Our mission is to establish blocking positions along the approaches and delay enemy armor as long as possible. Battalion has requested air support and artillery priority. Weather is expected to remain poor for at least 48 hours, so don't count on air. Someone asked the question everyone was thinking. What about ammunition? Did we get any HVAP? Moss shook his head. Negative. Standard combat load only. The crews looked at each other. Standard ammunition meant M82 rounds that wouldn't penetrate King Tiger frontal armor. It meant engaging the most heavily armored tanks in the German arsenal with a weapon officially rated as inadequate. Sir, Griffin said, the testing report from 703rd said, I know what the report said, Sergeant. Battalion knows too, but we don't have a choice. The Germans are coming, and we're what's available. Doctrine still applies. Use terrain. Shoot from defilade. Aim for tracks and optics if you can't get penetrations. And if you see a King Tiger, don't engage it frontally unless absolutely necessary. Then what do we do? Moss met Griffin's eyes. Get creative. That night, Griffin's crew positioned their M36 along a wooded ridge overlooking a farm road 2 miles east of St. Vith. The position gave them good observation and decent cover. A small hill to their right would provide concealment if they needed to displace quickly. The road below ran relatively straight for about 1,500 yards before curving into a tree line. They dug in as best they could. The ground was frozen, which made entrenchment difficult, but they managed to create a shallow hold-down position that exposed only the turret. Henderson positioned the vehicle carefully, ensuring they had a reverse route behind the ridge. Novak zeroed the gun on reference points along the road. Walsh organized ammunition, placing armor-piercing rounds for easy access. Griffin established communication with the platoon net and, with the infantry company, dug in 500 yards to their left. And then they waited. The temperature dropped. Frost formed on the turret ring. The crew took turns on watch. 2 men up, 2 men trying to sleep in the cramped interior. Griffin stayed in the turret with Novak, watching the road through binoculars, listening to increasingly confused radio traffic. Reports came in fragments. German armor advancing near Schönberg. American positions overrun at 3 separate points. Friendly forces withdrawing from sectors, unable to hold, ammunition running low, casualties heavy, and then, around 0300 hours on December 17th, a new report. Multiple King Tigers confirmed moving northwest on highway towards St. Vith, estimate 5 to 7 vehicles, infantry support, unknown additional armor. Griffin felt his stomach tighten. Multiple King Tigers. His M36, with its supposedly inadequate gun, was sitting directly in their path. The King Tigers appeared at dawn. Griffin saw them through the morning mist, dark shapes moving slowly along the farm road. He counted 5 vehicles initially, then spotted a 6th bringing up the rear, massive, angular, unmistakable. Each one displayed 70 tons of steel and menace. Behind them came infantry, maybe a company's worth, staying close to the tanks for protection. 2 half-tracks followed at a distance, and further back, Griffin could make out what looked like Panzer IVs, medium tanks providing support for the heavies. His hand found the radio handset. White 2 to White 1, contact 6 King Tigers approaching from the east plus infantry and supporting armor, range 2,000 yards. Lieutenant Moss's voice came back tight with tension. White 1 copies, hold position, do not engage until they're within effective range. Effective range. The phrase would have been funny if Griffin's mouth weren't so dry. According to the testing report, there was no effective range for the M36 against King Tiger frontal armor, not 2,000 yards, not 200. Novak was already tracking the lead vehicle through his sight. I can see the commander. He's standing in the cupola. Arrogant bastard. He's got reason to be, Walsh muttered from the loader's position. He knows we can't hurt him from the front. Griffin raised his binoculars again. The lead, King Tiger, was now 1,500 yards away, moving at perhaps 10 miles per hour. The German commander stood exposed in the turret, scanning the terrain ahead. The tank's gun pointed straight forward, a long barrel that looked almost too big for the turret. The Germans were advancing in a column formation, each tank about 50 yards behind the next. Standard road march. They weren't expecting contact, or, if they were, they didn't consider it a serious threat. Griffin's mind raced through the tactical problem. 6 King Tigers in column, frontal armor, impenetrable, side armor, vulnerable, but difficult to target. The lead tank would reach their position in roughly 5 minutes at current speed. If he engaged frontally and failed to penetrate, the Germans would identify his position immediately. Return fire would come within seconds. The King Tiger's gun could destroy the M36 with a single hit, but if he didn't engage, the column would pass within 400 yards of his position. They might spot him anyway, and they'd continue towards St. Vith, where American infantry were dug in, with weapons completely inadequate for stopping heavy armor. Range 1,300, Novak said quietly. The lead, King Tiger, kept coming. Griffin could see details now through his binoculars. The Zimmerit anti-magnetic paste coating the hull. The track links, each one as big as a man's torso. The commander's face under his headset, looking left toward a farm building. Range 1,200, Griffin made his decision. Henderson, when I give the word, you're going to reverse us hard behind the ridge. Novak, you're going to put 1 round into the side of the last tank in the column. Not the lead, the last one. Aim for the turret ring. Novak's voice rose. The last one. But Sergeant, the last one. The others will have to turn around to engage us. That's 30 seconds minimum with their turret traverse. We shoot, we displace, we relocate to alternate position. Questions? Walsh spoke up. What if we don't penetrate? Then we're no worse off than if we'd done nothing. Load armor piercing. Up! Griffin watched the column continue forward. The lead tank was now 900 yards away, too close for comfort. The last tank was 1,400 yards, just entering the straight section of road. He waited. Patience was agony. Every instinct screamed to fire now, to do something. But he needed the geometry to be right, needed the last tank to reach a point where its side armor was exposed, where the angle would be favorable, where a side shot might actually work. Range to rear target 1,100 yards, Novak said. He'd figured out Griffin's plan and adjusted his aim. I have a good angle on his left side. Wait. The column kept moving. 1,000 yards. The commander of the 3rd King Tiger was pointing at something to the right, speaking into his radio. The formation began to slow. They see something, Walsh said. They see the infantry positions, Griffin said. They're preparing to engage. Novak, you ready? Angle's good. Side armor exposed, targeting turret ring. Griffin took a breath. This was the moment. 6 King Tigers, supposedly invulnerable, and he was about to find out if a 90mm gun really was as inadequate as the testing report claimed. Fire! The gun roared. The M36's entire frame shuddered with recoil. The muzzle blast created a massive cloud of white smoke that instantly obscured Griffin's view. His ears rang despite the padded headset. Hit! Novak shouted. Penetration. The turret. Go! Griffin yelled at Henderson. Reverse now! The M36's engine screamed. The tank destroyer lurched backward, tracks churning frozen ground. They shot behind the ridge just as the first German return fire arrived. An 88mm shell passed through the space where they'd been 3 seconds earlier, impacting a tree 200 yards behind them. Henderson didn't slow down. He kept reversing, following the route they'd planned, putting terrain between them and the German guns. More shells fell, bracketing their last position, but the Germans were shooting at where they'd been, not where they were. Alternate position, Griffin commanded. Henderson yanked the controls left, spun the M36 around a barn, and raced north along a farm track they'd reconnoitered the previous night. 600 yards later, he pulled into a prepared position behind a stone wall. The entire displacement had taken 90 seconds. Griffin grabbed his binoculars and scrambled to where he could observe the German column. What he saw made his breath catch. The last King Tiger was stopped, smoke pouring from its turret. The turret itself sat at an odd angle, clearly damaged. The crew was bailing out, tumbling from hatches and running away from the burning vehicle. "Jesus," Walsh breathed. "We killed a King Tiger." But that wasn't what held Griffin's attention. What amazed him was what the other 5 King Tigers were doing. They weren't advancing. They weren't charging forward to support the infantry. They'd stopped. All 5 of them had halted in place, their commanders buttoned up inside, their guns traversing frantically, searching for the source of the shot that had just destroyed one of their number. They were scared. Griffin keyed the radio. "White 2 to White 1. Rear target destroyed. Column has halted. They're looking for us." A pause. Then Moss's voice, disbelief clear even through the radio static. "Say again, White 2. You destroyed a King Tiger?" "Affirmative. Side shot to the turret ring." "Complete penetration." Another pause. Longer this time. Griffin imagined Moss processing the information, comparing it against the testing report, against everything they'd been told about the M36's inadequacy. "White 1, to all white elements. You heard White 2. The 90mm works if you get the angle right. All units prepare to engage from flanking positions. Repeat, flanking positions only. Do not engage frontally." Griffin smiled. It was a tight, hard smile, but genuine. The Germans had designed the King Tiger to be invulnerable from the front. They'd armored it so heavily that no Allied gun could penetrate its glacis. They'd trained their crews to always keep the front toward the enemy, to use that massive frontal armor as an impenetrable shield. But armor wasn't a shield if you didn't know which direction the threat was coming from. The German column was paralyzed. Their doctrine said, keep the front toward the enemy. But where was the enemy? The shot had come from their left, rear. But when they'd turned to engage that position, the attacker was gone. Was it still there? Had it moved? Were there more American tank destroyers hidden nearby? The German commander, probably in the lead tank, was facing an impossible problem. If he continued the advance, he'd expose his column's flanks to an enemy he couldn't see. If he turned the entire column to face the threat, he'd stall the offensive and expose different tanks' flanks to potential fire from other directions. If he spread out to cover multiple angles, he'd break formation and lose. Mutual support. The King Tiger's greatest advantage, its impenetrable frontal armor, had become its greatest vulnerability, because now it had to protect that armor from threats that might come from any direction. Griffin watched through his binoculars as the German column began a slow, awkward repositioning. The lead tank turned 90 degrees left, pointing its gun toward Griffin's last firing position. The second and third tanks moved to create a defensive perimeter. The fourth tank backed up, trying to protect the disabled vehicle's crew. They were no longer an assault force. They were a defensive position, static and vulnerable. "White 4 to White 1, came another voice on the radio. "Lieutenant Morrison's platoon, positioned a half-mile to the north. I have 3 targets at 1,600 yards. Permission to engage flanks. White 1 copies. Engage at will." Griffin didn't see Morrison's shot, but he heard the gun and saw the result. Another King Tiger shuddered to a halt, thick black smoke pouring from its engine deck. The crew bailed out immediately. Now, the Germans were in real trouble. 2 King Tigers disabled. 4 operational. But those 4 were surrounded by terrain that could hide American tank destroyers, facing an enemy that had demonstrated it could kill them if it got the right angle. The German commander made his decision. The column withdrew. It wasn't a rout. The operational King Tigers backed up carefully, keeping their frontal armor toward the American positions, covering the disabled vehicle's crews as they retreated. But it was absolutely a withdrawal. 6 King Tigers had run into American M36s, lost 2 vehicles, and decided discretion was the better part of valor. Griffin watched them go, hardly believing what he was seeing. The King Tiger was supposed to be invincible. Testing had said the 90mm couldn't penetrate its armor. Every tactical briefing had emphasized avoiding engagement with German heavy tanks unless absolutely necessary. But 2 King Tigers were burning on a farm road in Belgium because crews using inadequate guns had figured out that armor thickness didn't matter if you shot at the thin parts. The radio traffic exploded with excited chatter. Other positions reporting successful engagements. Panthers destroyed at long range. A Panther knocked out at nearly 2,000 yards. German armor pulling back across multiple sectors. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lieutenant Moss came over the net. All white elements, consolidate positions and prepare for counterattack. They'll be back and they'll be smarter about it, but outstanding work, outstanding. Griffin slumped back in the turret, suddenly exhausted. Novak was grinning like a madman. Walsh kept saying, "We killed a King Tiger," over and over. Even Henderson, usually stoic, had a huge smile, but Griffin's mind was already moving to the next problem. They'd won this engagement because the Germans hadn't expected effective resistance. The next time, they'd be more careful. They'd advance with better reconnaissance. They'd use infantry to flush out American positions before committing armor. The tactical advantage of surprise was gone. Over the next 3 days, the battle developed into a grinding defensive action. German forces continued to push towards St. Vith from multiple directions. American units, outnumbered and outgunned, traded space for time, falling back from position to position, making the Germans pay for every mile. The M-36s of the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion were constantly in motion. Shoot, displace, relocate, find a flanking angle, take the shot, get out before return fire arrived. Never engage frontally. Always seek the side or rear armor. Make the Germans turn to face you, then hit them from a different angle. It was exhausting, nerve-wracking work, but it was effective. On December 18th, Griffin's crew destroyed a Panther at 1,400 yards with a single shot through the side turret armor. On the 19th, they knocked out a Jagged Panther tank destroyer from ambush, the 90mm round penetrating the superstructure and detonating the ammunition. On the 20th, they engaged 2 Panzer P4s, destroying both in less than a minute. Other crews reported similar successes. The 702nd destroyed 23 German armored vehicles in 5 days. The 703rd, the same battalion that had conducted the testing, declaring the 90mm inadequate, destroyed 18. The 740th, also equipped with M36s, claimed 14 kills, including 3 more King Tigers. The German advance slowed, then stalled, then stopped altogether at St. Vith. American resistance, combined with deteriorating weather and supply problems, forced the Germans to bypass the town rather than take it directly. The planned breakthrough to the Meuse River never happened. The Battle of the Bulge would continue until late January 1945, but the critical phase, the race to stop the German breakthrough, ended in the 3rd week of December. M36 tank destroyers played a crucial role in that success. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The weapon officially declared inadequate against German heavy armor had proven devastatingly effective when used correctly. The gun that failed testing had killed dozens of Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers in actual combat. What had changed? Not the gun, not the ammunition. What changed was understanding. The testing conducted by the 703rd Battalion in early December had been methodologically sound. An M36 firing standard, M82 armor-piercing rounds could not penetrate Tiger II frontal armor at any combat range. That was accurate. The testing report said so explicitly, and battlefield experience confirmed it. But the testing had evaluated the gun against a static target, head-on, under ideal conditions. It measured maximum penetration against maximum armor thickness. It answered the question, can this gun defeat this armor frontally? Combat asked a different question. Can this gun kill this tank? The answer turned out to be yes, if you didn't fight on the tank's terms. The King Tiger was designed around a tactical philosophy that had served Germany well. Present your strongest armor to the enemy. Use superior firepower to dominate the engagement. Rely on armor thickness to defeat incoming fire. It worked brilliantly when fighting Soviet tanks that had to approach across open ground, when engaging British armor in defensive positions, when the Germans controlled the engagement parameters. It worked less well against American tank destroyer doctrine that emphasized mobility, flexibility, and refusing to fight fair. American crews learned quickly. Don't fight King Tigers head on. Don't sit still and trade shots. Move constantly. Use terrain. Find angles where the armor is thinner. The turret ring, the engine deck, the side hull, the rear plate. Every tank had vulnerable spots. The trick was getting a shot at those spots before the enemy could return fire. The M36 was perfect for this kind of warfare. It had good gun depression, allowing it to fire from hull-down positions. The electric turret traverse was fast enough to track moving targets. The chassis, based on the Sherman, was reliable and easy to maintain. And the 90mm gun, while inadequate against frontal armor, was absolutely devastating against side armor at any range where you could hit the target. By late December, German tank commanders had learned to fear the M36. Intelligence reports captured after the battle showed that German units specifically warned about American tank destroyers with powerful guns that attacked from unexpected angles. Tactical guidance emphasized maintaining all-round security and avoiding linear formations where side armor could be exposed. The King Tiger remained a formidable weapon, but it was no longer invincible. The myth of German armor superiority, already cracking, shattered completely during the Ardennes offensive. The testing report from early December was never officially corrected. It remained on file, accurately documenting that the M36's 90mm gun could not penetrate Tiger II frontal armor with standard ammunition. The report wasn't wrong. It just wasn't relevant. Because combat isn't a test range. Tanks don't sit motionless, presenting their thickest armor. Doctrine matters, tactics matter. And a weapon's effectiveness depends as much on how it's used as on its theoretical capabilities. Frank Griffin survived the Battle of the Bulge. His M36 was knocked out on January 8, 1945, by a Panzerfaust wielded by German infantry during street fighting near Höfelitz. The crew bailed out without casualties and was reassigned to a replacement vehicle within 24 hours. Griffin continued fighting with the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion until the German surrender in May 1945. His personal tally included 2 King Tigers, 4 Panthers, 3 Panzerpfeifers, and 1 Jagd Panther. He was awarded the Silver Star for his actions on December 17th when he destroyed the first King Tiger. The citation mentioned his exemplary courage and tactical skill in engaging superior enemy armor. It did not mention that he was using a weapon officially rated as inadequate for the task. After the war, Griffin rarely talked about his combat experiences. When he did, he had a standard answer for people who asked about fighting German heavy tanks. The Germans built the best tanks of the war. Thick armor, powerful guns, well designed. But they forgot that the best tank isn't the one that can take the most hits. It's the one that doesn't get hit in the first place. The M36 Jackson continued in service long after World War II ended. It fought in Korea, where it easily destroyed North Korean T-34-85s. It served with Allied armies around the world throughout the 1950s and 60s. Yugoslavia used M36s during the Balkan conflicts in the 1990s, more than 50 years after the vehicle's initial design. The 90mm gun that failed testing in December 1944 went on to arm the M26 Pershing, America's first successful heavy tank. The same gun, with minor modifications, armed the M46 and M47 Patton tanks. Variants of the 90mm remained in American service until the early 1960s. The lessons learned during the Battle of the Bulge shaped American armor doctrine for decades. The emphasis on mobility over armor protection, on firepower over survivability, on tactical flexibility over rigid engagement parameters, all became hallmarks of American armored warfare through the Cold War and beyond. But perhaps the most enduring lesson wasn't about tanks or guns or tactics. It was about the danger of accepting limitations at face value. The testing report that declared the 90mm inadequate was accurate within its parameters, but combat operates outside parameters. Real battles don't follow test protocols. The German engineers who designed the King Tiger assumed enemies would engage frontally because that's how tank combat had always worked. They built their tank to win that kind of fight. American crews simply refused to fight that way. They asked different questions, pursued different solutions, and won battles with weapons that shouldn't have worked. This pattern repeated throughout the war. British forces used inadequate 2-pounder guns to destroy Italian tanks in North Africa by targeting vision ports and track assemblies. Soviet crews in T-34s defeated Tigers by overwhelming them through sheer numbers and accepting catastrophic losses. American bomber crews survived unsurvivable damage through modifications never considered by designers. The testing report that declared the 90mm inadequate remains a fascinating document. It's accurate in every technical detail. The penetration figures are correct. The metallurgical analysis is sound. The conclusions follow logically from the methodology. What the report couldn't measure was human ingenuity, the ability of crews under pressure to find solutions to impossible problems, the willingness to ignore official conclusions and trust battlefield experience, the tactical creativity that turned a weapon's weakness into strength by refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. The story of the M36 Jackson during the Battle of the Bulge is ultimately a story about the limits of testing and the importance of adaptability. It's about soldiers who looked at a problem, rejected the official answer, and found their own solution. It's about the difference between what weapons can do in theory and what they accomplish in the hands of people determined to succeed. December 14, 1944, testing said the M36 couldn't kill King Tigers. December 17th, crews did it anyway. The difference between those 3 days was understanding that adequate depends entirely on context, that limitations are often just failure of imagination, and that the purpose of a weapon isn't to pass tests, it's to win battles. The M36 Jackson won battles. It did so with a gun everyone said wouldn't work, against tanks everyone said were invincible by crews who decided official testing was less important than finding a way to get the job done. In the end, that's what separated the inadequate from the legendary. Not the weapon itself, but the refusal to accept what couldn't be done. The story of the M36 Jackson during the Battle of the Bulge is ultimately a story about the limits of testing and the importance of adaptability. It's about soldiers who looked at a problem, rejected the official answer, and found their own solution. It's about the difference between what weapons can do in theory and what they accomplish in the hands of people determined to succeed. December 14th, 1944, testing said the M36 couldn't kill King Tigers. December 17th, crews did it anyway. The difference between those 3 days was understanding that adequate depends entirely on context, that limitations are often just failure of imagination, and that the purpose of a weapon isn't to pass tests, it's to win battles. The M36 Jackson won battles. It did so with a gun everyone said wouldn't work, against tanks everyone said were invincible by crews who decided official testing was less important than finding a way to get the job done. The testing report that declared the 90mm inadequate wasn't just a technical document, it was a psychological weapon the Germans never knew they'd deployed. When American crews received word that their gun couldn't penetrate King Tiger armor, morale plummeted. Some requested transfers, others wrote home describing impossible odds. But the crews at St. Vith never gave the Germans that satisfaction. They took the testing report, acknowledged its accuracy, and proceeded to ignore its implications. They didn't deny the King Tiger's frontal armor was impenetrable. They simply decided not to shoot at the frontal armor. This mindset became characteristic of American military innovation. Accept the limitation, refuse to be limited by it. It appeared again in Korea, when outgunned forces used mobility to counter superior numbers. It continues today in asymmetric warfare, where technological disadvantages are overcome through tactical creativity. The testing engineers weren't wrong. They were correct within their framework, but frameworks like armor can be circumvented. The real failure wasn't the gun's penetration capability. It was assuming penetration capability was the only measure that mattered. When Griffin positioned his M36 to engage the rear tank in the German column, he wasn't defying physics. He was defying the assumption that battle had to be fought on German terms. The King Tiger's designers created a tank optimized for frontal engagements. Griffin simply declined to provide one. The M36 Jackson destroyed more than 300 German armored vehicles during the final 6 months of World War II. It did this not by being better than testing said it was, but by being used differently than testing assumed it would be. That distinction between inherent capability and effective application is the true legacy. The gun that failed testing succeeded in combat because the men using it understood that success isn't about meeting specifications. It's about achieving objectives, regardless of what specifications say is possible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.